Free speech isn't something which is just one of a set of things you can pick and choose from. It is the absolutely central right upon which every other right is based. And that awareness of that, it strikes me, is disappearing all the time. Its absolute centrality, I would say, is being demonstrated day in and day out at the moment. And let me give you an example of that. The migration crisis through which Europe is going at the moment has been made infinitely worse at absolutely every step of the way by our inability to understand the importance of free speech. Absolutely every step of that journey. It's my belief that when the speech goes wrong, the ideas go wrong, and when the ideas go wrong, the politics goes wrong. And our politics has gone so very wrong in recent years because the speech has gone wrong, because the ideas have gone wrong. Let me give you a couple of examples. In September last year, at the height of the crisis that she herself had created, Chancellor Merkel sat at a lunch at the UN in New York and was sitting next to Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook. And Chancellor Merkel, unfortunately, as can happen to anybody, had an open mic. Her mic was still on, or there was a mic on the table that was on, and it picked up about 30 seconds of the conversation between her and Mark Zuckerberg, which they had thought was private. And in it, Chancellor Merkel opens by saying to Mark Zuckerberg, "What can you do to stop people writing anti-migration stuff on Facebook?" And his reply was, "We're working on it." Now, absolutely everything, in my view, that has gone wrong in Europe in recent years can be traced back to that exchange. It epitomizes the problem. Chancellor Merkel, by the way, doesn't just try to stop criticism of herself. She tried to stop through Facebook the dissemination of almost any view of the migration crisis that was not entirely supportive of her point of view. And when I say that when the speech goes wrong, the politics goes wrong, here are just a few examples of how that happens. George Orwell said, it's one of the quotes that was on the handout for this conference, famously said that if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. So let me divide this into two different sections. Firstly, what Chancellor Merkel and other politicians across our continent, and particularly I would say the Swedish government, did not want people to hear. They did not want to hear that letting in millions of people into Europe in the space of months would massively destabilize European society for our long-term future. They didn't want to hear it. They wanted to believe that societies, cultures like ours, are such enormously powerful things that you could allow in millions of people from totally different cultures and that they would get with the program on the second or so day they arrived. I don't see cultures like that, by the way. I see them more as kind of fragile ecosystems, which take years and years to grow up, decades and centuries to develop, and which can be destroyed in the space of a lifetime. Chancellor Merkel and her colleagues took a different view. But by shutting down the debate, at no point did they allow themselves access to the questions that they should have been asking. And the remarkable thing about this is that only 5 years before she made that catastrophic, to my mind, decision, Chancellor Merkel gave one of her most famous speeches in which she said that multiculturalism had failed. What did she mean by that? She said it herself. She said, at the beginning of the speech, she said, you know, we had assumed that the guest workers would go home. To my mind, this is a demonstration of every single thing in the post-war migration period in Europe having been woefully misunderstood. At no stage did any of our politicians ever anticipate the things that would happen next. At no stage. People thought that the people who came in would leave. People thought they wouldn't come in such large numbers. People thought they would come in such large numbers, but then they would integrate. People then thought maybe they shouldn't integrate. Some people said you should integrate, and their colleagues said no, that's colonialist thinking, and so on. So we were confused throughout this whole episode, and we were partly confused because we deliberately stopped ourselves from having the discussion. That we will end up having to have at some point anyway. Let me give you one quick example. It's been obvious to me for a long time that if you say that if you open the borders, as Chancellor Merkel did last year, you have an absolute horde of questions that follow on next. It would seem to me that the most obvious question to ask is Europe a place in which anyone in the world who wants a better life can legitimately come and live? That's the beginning of a question to ask. The current thinking, it seems, is to stem the flow at the time being, but we still haven't addressed any of the fundamental questions. I was asking a German politician about this the other day in Berlin, where I was with Daniel Pipes and his group. If you go, as I have done, to all the points of entry in the Greek islands and Italian islands, you see an undoubted tide of human misery. There is no way of glossing this. It is people from across sub-Saharan Africa, across North Africa, across the Middle East, the Far East, coming to Europe for all sorts of reasons. They want a better life. Many of them are fleeing war. Many of them are fleeing political persecution. They are terrible, terrible stories. But none of the answers that Chancellor Merkel and her colleagues have given could possibly answer this question. What, for instance, do you say to an Afghan refugee, like one I was speaking to the other day on the island of Lesbos, who said, why have the Germans given preferential asylum treatment to the Syrians? The Syrians have only had a civil war for 5 years. We've had one for 15. Why don't you make sure you have as generous provision for all the people from Afghanistan who'd like to come to Germany and Europe as you do for everybody else? Eritrea, which almost nobody in Europe had heard of until the last year, is a terrible society. It's undoubtedly a society in which very, very many millions of people, if they had the chance, would want to leave and come to Europe. The current discussion about this has reduced to the discussion of legitimate asylum seekers and economic migrants. Let's say that the Vice Commissioner of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, was right earlier this year when he said in his estimate at least 60% of the people who arrived into Europe in 2015 had no more right to be in Europe than anybody else in the world. Let's say that's right. Let's say that there are going to be consequences from that. Let's say that Germany is therefore going to deport 750,000 people who arrived last year. Let's say that Sweden is going to, as one of your government ministers pretended, deport 80,000 of the people who arrived last year. None of this is going to happen. It's an absolute lie, and they must know it as they say it. They must know it. There is no way on earth that they have the provision or the political will to carry out such an act. So they continue to fib themselves, and the press and others continue to go along with not asking the questions they want. So here is one which gets us towards, as it were, the point of conclusion faster. Let's pretend that Chancellor Merkel and Jean-Claude Juncker, who we in Britain thankfully no longer have to see very much of, let's say that they invented in the coming weeks a machine, a sort of body scanner-like machine that you get at airports, which when you walked through it at the southern points of entry into Europe, determined at a bleep whether you're a legitimate asylum seeker or an economic migrant. And let's say that there was the political will to, in fact, repatriate so the 6 out of 10 or so who were economic migrants rather than legitimate asylum seekers. Does Europe still want to insist on welcoming everybody in the world who is a legitimate asylum seeker? Now, my view is that, laudable as that is, it's impossible. Recently on one of the Greek islands, I was speaking to some young men from Bangladesh. They are opponents of the regime there, they are enemies of the government, and they have a completely legitimate asylum claim in Europe. But if you add up all of these countries, from Bangladesh and Pakistan and Afghanistan and Iran and Iraq and Syria, and across the Middle East, and you go all across North Africa and down into sub-Saharan Africa, you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of people who have absolutely legitimate asylum claims to come to Europe. And this is a discussion which I very rarely hear. I very rarely hear any politician willing to get into the long grass on this and talk about it realistically. And here is then the second problem of that. If the politicians don't allow the speech, then you get bad speech. Then the speech goes wrong. Let me give you a couple of examples. In recent months, I've noticed an upsurge on social media and across some protest groups in Europe of talking about refugees in the most appalling terms. You can see protest movements that describe all migrants to Europe as, for instance, rape-fugees, or some that will call them, for instance, refugee-jihadists, an unamusing term, a dumb term as well as being an offensive one. But that's what you end up getting. Chancellor Merkel pretends that all of the people coming are legitimate, all of the people are good, none of them will ever do anything bad, Europe is their new home. And then the response, sure as anything, is that you get people who say that all of these people, including many people who fled from rape and jihad, are themselves rapists and jihadists. It's the same thing you can see being played out in the States. You get a president who is so unwilling to say the word Islam or Islamist or Islamism or Islamic terrorism and so on, that he, even when an American hostage is decapitated by a guy shouting Allahu Akbar in the Syrian desert, says that that attack probably had less to do with Islam than with any other religion. It's inevitable when you have a US president who says that somewhere down the road you're going to get a counterpart who says, for instance, not one Muslim should come into the States. It's yin and yang, as obvious as night follows day, that that's what happens. Because the generation of politicians who've been in charge tried to stop the debate, tried to stop the discussion, and so the discussion is turning rancid across Europe. This seems to me to be the clearest possible threat to our societies in Europe, and one which we are unbelievably loath to admit to. You know, Mencken, I said I'd give you another quote. H.L. Mencken once also said, "The most dangerous man to any government is the man who's able to think things out for himself and without regard to the prevailing superstitions and taboos." But we have so many prevailing superstitions and taboos in our societies, and our politicians found them so incredibly helpful for years, that I genuinely see for the first time, I think, in my adult life, how bad this could go in Europe. For the last week, we've gone to Paris, to Berlin, and now to Stockholm. When somebody said to me the other day in Stockholm that they thought that Sweden was the craziest country in the world, apart perhaps from North Korea, I can assure you that having been to North Korea, you're on a very level pegging. There are so many things that one can see going wrong because, as I say, the speech has gone wrong, because the ideas have gone wrong, and we never thought them out. We never had the courage to go through with them, and people tried to shut us up and silence us. Well, if there's any point to a day like today, it is to say no to that, to say we will insist, we will disagree among ourselves, we will disagree with each other, and there will be much debate and discussion in the years ahead and things on which we will all disagree. But that on one thing in particular we have to be firm, which is that there should be nobody, no German judge, no German chancellor, no Swedish politician, no Brussels bureaucrat or British politician who should stop us from saying what we think about our own future. And that we have that right, we will retain that right, and we'll retain it whatever happens in the years ahead. Thank you.
One question you often get when you say this bizarre migration policy that Sweden is pursuing, and to a certain extent other countries, is unsustainable, immoral, anti-democratic, illogical, and so on, is, but if you were a poor African, wouldn't you want to migrate to Europe? And the answer to that is, of course, yes.
Yes.
So how can you then deny someone else to do that? And I usually answer that it's not my decision. Give the people the right to decide, put all the cards on the table, what it costs, the amount of crime, and so on. However, that's a fairly dry answer. That's my type of answer. Do you have another answer?
There are all sorts of answers. Everything in the migration business, as I say, is damaged by not really having the discussion out. This is a discussion we should have had decades ago. The nature of what an asylum seeker is a discussion we should have had decades ago. The discussion of, for instance, how long somebody can remain an asylum seeker if, for instance, the situation in their country of origin has changed is a discussion we should have had a long time ago. If you go to Rome, to the marketplace there are Egyptian gangs, among others, who run a lot of the marketplace there. They include people working in the black market who are Egyptian migrants who fled from previous Egyptian governments, some of whom, not all of whom, but some of whom want to return home. Okay? What is the Italian government doing about that? Nothing. There's no policy for this. There's no more policy than there is in Sweden to send back all the people who shouldn't have come last year. There's no policy for it. It's not going to happen. There is no political will for it. But these are discussions, as I say, we should have had decades ago. If, as everyone agreed, multiculturalism wasn't working in 2010 when immigration was at a comparative low point, why should it work when immigration is at an absolute historic high? It makes no sense. And as for as it were, the moral question underneath this, I think there is a profound question here which I'm not going to be able to answer, but I can give a couple of pointers on. It's the same question as the one which is, in my view, haunting Europe, which is the question of the Jews. The question of the Jews in the Second World War. You see this all around the migration crisis. There was a very haunting example the other day in La Stampa, one of the Italian papers, talking about the route now that the Austrian-Italian border and the French-Italian borders are very, very closed. There is an increasing flow of people walking through the mountain passes in over to Switzerland from North Italy. La Stampa had it was just an average day's news, but had a quote from a local who mentioned that this was a route which, in the winter it's very dangerous, but in the summer it's passable. And just this local just mentions that's the route the Jews used in the war. Everything is infused in our very old and very guilt-ridden continent. Everything is infused with these echoes, and we worry about it, and we're right to worry about it. We're right to worry about whether or not these migrants are the same as the migrants in the Second World War. But there are all sorts of other parts of that discussion we need to have. For instance, how many of the Jews fleeing Nazi Germany, for instance, arrived in a safe country and then said, I don't find the system here so useful, I'll walk to another. Yeah. How many of those fleeing persecution before and during the Second World War were picky about it? I mean, it's a terrible thing to say, but I mean, this is a different type of movement. But the follow-on from that is this odd thing, which I say I don't have an answer to, but I can just put an idea in your head about it, which is this odd thing that, as I say, Europe is a place in which anyone in the world can come and live. I think we need to think about this and discuss this very widely and very profoundly, because otherwise, as I say, this is going to lead to all sorts of problems in the years ahead. It seems to me absolutely legitimate that the peoples of Europe should be able to have a place they call home, and that place should not be taken away from them, because after all, we don't have another choice. There's that extraordinarily haunting bit in Michel Houellebecq's Submission, which many of you will know, when talking with his Jewish girlfriend, the main character discovers she's going to go to Israel because things have got so bad in France and she's Jewish, and he says, I don't have an Israel. That is one of the most important thoughts in Europe. Now, we don't have an opt-out, we don't have a get-out, we don't have a place to run to. We don't have another deal on the side here. This is our home. And so we should think very, very deeply before giving that home up to the entire world. Because among other things, that deal will not be reciprocal. When Europeans go to another country by the millions, it's colonialism. Colonialism, thank goodness, has ended. But we haven't even begun to think of the consequences of the movement of millions of people into our home for what we agree is in perpetuity. I do not believe that it is the right of everybody in the world who wants to be in Europe to be in Europe. And it cannot be. We have, as I say, a fragile ecosystem of society, like every society, and we cannot give it over to the entire world. And if that makes us have some pangs of guilt, then that's good. We should have pangs of guilt over that. We're human beings. We're moral beings. But it should not be the case that our pangs of guilt make us destroy our societies. It's my view as a small c conservative that Edmund Burke was right in that central point of his philosophy, that a culture, a society is not simply about us here now, that it is a deal between the dead, the living, and those yet to be born. And that you cannot break that pact, and that what you have inherited you do not have the right to give away, any more than you have the right to destroy future generations of your own family or future generations yet unborn. It is a very central pact to civilization, that deal between the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. It is a central pact of civilization. And if you give it up, if you say that the yet to be born, it doesn't matter if their society represents Mogadishu more than it does downtown Stockholm, then you are breaking that pact, which may not be yours to break.
Thank you for all. Thank you.